Welcome to Finding Avalon, the podcast that amplifies disabled voices. I'm your host, Jenna, a disability inclusion advocate, communicator, and storyteller. This is a place where disabled folks correct the narrative by sharing authentic lived experiences. Join me as we explore life with disability through our lens, because representation matters. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Finding Avalon podcast. This is a place where we normalize sharing and celebrating disabled, chronically ill, and neurodivergent experiences, one story at a time. And speaking of wisdom and leadership, I've got Kristina Kyser with me today, joining the show from North York, Ontario. Kristina is a former psychotherapist who worked for well over a decade predominantly supporting adults with severe childhood trauma. As a child, she was labeled gifted and later diagnosed with PTSD in her 20s. She's also a mother of 3 adult sons. Today, at age 50, after a lifetime of high masking while experiencing many unexplained or misdiagnosed physical and psychological symptoms, Kristina arrived at the realization that she was autistic with ADHD. She's also a survivor of domestic abuse who's passionate about healing and growth, dispelling shame around childhood and adulthood trauma and its serious risks to neurodivergent women and other high-masking, late-diagnosed adults. With her years of experience in mental health and wellness, Kristina is currently building a business as a psychospiritual teacher and meditation facilitator. She believes passionately in equality, liberation, and transformation, and she finds peace in nature, animals, music, and books. Welcome, Kristina.
Thank you, Jen. I'm so happy to be here.
Thanks so much for being on the show. I'm so delighted to have you here, especially on a Friday night. Before we get into our discussion, I do want to give listeners a trigger warning, as we will be discussing topics that may be distressing to survivors. Please skip this episode if you feel like this will be too distressing for you, or if you do want to listen but worry that you might be triggered. Please pause at any time that you need to, reach for supports, and if and when you feel ready to continue, come on back to the episode. But your well-being matters first and foremost. I'll begin this episode by stating some facts. Disabled women are 3 times more likely to experience gender-based violence, and this includes sexual violence. A violence that is undeniably and overwhelmingly committed by men and boys against women, girls, and gender-diverse people. And when it comes to relationships and family life, disabled women are also twice as likely to experience intimate partner violence. In fact, disabled women are more likely to experience domestic abuse with more than one partner, which can be devastating for a woman who is disabled or chronically ill to survive unthinkable abuse and trauma, not just once, but possibly 2 or 3 times, through no fault of her own. It is the predators who target vulnerable women and their patterned behavior of control, coercion, and violence who purposely choose women who are marginalized and vulnerable. And the abuse of disabled women is not just in intimate partner relationships. It's also related to family and the wider community. In fact, disabled, chronically ill, and neurodivergent girls and women are at a higher risk of abuse and neglect by family members and caretakers. They're also at a heightened risk if they've also witnessed their own mothers being abused or if they grew up with other types of family violence around them. Disabled and neurodivergent girls and teens are routinely subjected to harsh punishment and neglect in their homes, behind the closed doors of seemingly perfect families or community groups. They're also routinely not believed or supported because of people's ableist view and stigma around disability. And of course, some are also harmed by predatory community members with access to them and with power in schools, churches, sports organizations, the healthcare system, and many other places where they should be safe. Disabled girls and women are frequent targets for grooming and abuse by predators in the community, even when it's a well-kept secret but widely known in a community where silence, fear, and stigma prevails. You won't need to look very far in your own communities, your own experiences, your own conversations, and your own research on this topic to confirm these frightening realities. And that's why it's crucial we speak about it and place the shame right where it belongs, with the abusers. And neurodivergent girls, women, and gender diverse folks are especially vulnerable to being abused and traumatized, which Kristina will speak to in a moment. And a final eye opening statistic: high masking autistic women, women like Kristina, women like me, are 7 times more likely to die by suicide due to lack of support and understanding, thanks to systemic barriers in community, law enforcement, and healthcare. 7 times more at risk of dying by suicide. This sobering summary of the risks that disabled women face is too important to ignore. As a survivor myself, my stance is this: knowing about and witnessing abuse, but not taking any action or just looking the other way, makes you complicit. If a child, teen, or woman comes to you, especially one who is disabled, and asks for your help and you do nothing, you have chosen the side of abuse and injustice. Silence or being an apologist for abusers is also complicity. Abuse is not something we should just accept because previous generations accepted it. The amount of damaged people in this world, including people who have become disabled as a result of years of abuse, is proof in itself how harmful generational trauma and cycles of abuse can be. I will never stop talking about this as long as I live, because we need to hold abusers and abusive systems accountable and get justice and peace for survivors, especially those survivors who are at an increased risk, like disabled survivors. We all know it takes courage to do the right thing and protect those who are vulnerable. Reporting and removing these risks and actively becoming part of the change are things that we can all do together to make sure everyone in our community has a safe place to belong. That's why it's so important to have professionally trained people, including those with lived experience, leading the charge, acting in service of their community. And that's exactly what Kristina has devoted herself to. Even though Kristina and I have never met before now, and we're in different parts of the country, we have many things in common, and we wanted to shine a light on the connections between child abuse, gender-based violence, and neurodivergence in women. We're what survivors look like. We're what survivors act like. And I know some of you listening are also survivors, and I'm so thankful that you're still here with us, however painful I can imagine that your path has been. So now that you've heard all of this context and you're all buckled up, if you're ready, Kristina, shall we begin?
Absolutely. Let's dive in.
Childhood trauma is a terribly common experience, something so many of us know personally. The World Health Organization states that globally, an estimated 1 billion children aged 2 to 17 years old have experienced physical, sexual, or emotional violence or neglect in just this past year. There's been mounting societal concern about the lifelong health and well-being impacts that experiencing violence in childhood has on a person, both in the moment and for the lifetime to follow. Kristina, in your time as a psychotherapist, serving all kinds of people with trauma, what did you notice about patterns between people's adverse childhood and life experiences and society's systems of oppression? And what kind of impact did that have on your own worldview and personal mission?
As a psychotherapist doing trauma work, what I was confronted with again and again was that trauma isn't just personal, it's systemic. It it lives in individual bodies, yes, but it's rooted in history, in culture, and in systems of oppression. And for me, the most striking examples of this came through my work with Indigenous patients. So at first, this work brought me sort of a series of revelations about their trauma. But then what surprised me most was the mirror it held up to my own trauma and to the collective trauma of the dominant culture that we live in. So my training had focused heavily on the family of origin, on locating the roots of suffering in the immediate family. But what I witnessed in my Indigenous patients completely shattered that frame. The trauma they were holding wasn't confined to childhood, it reached across generations, and it was the result, of course, of the genocide by the Canadian state, being systematically killed and stripped of their language, their ceremony, their kinship, and their cosmology. What complicated this for me was that in session, they also spoke of their connection to their ancestors, to Creator, a connection to spirit that remained intact despite everything that they had endured. So their pain and their trauma were immense, but so was their orientation to something larger than what the Western psychotherapeutic model often allows. So both the trauma and this spiritual context exceeded what I had been taught. And that really broke something open in me. I had never been pointed towards or supported in facing my own ancestral grief as the descendant of settlers and immigrants. I'd never been invited to grieve what had been lost in my own lineage, what had been cut off by whiteness, colonization, by privilege, and by the demands to assimilate into a culture that denies the sacred. So, this brought up a grief in me that my training hadn't prepared me for. And I began to seek other forms of knowing that also took me outside patriarchal norms. I did and continue to do deep work around whiteness and white supremacy. And I also studied with and received rights from a medicine woman. And I began to repair my connection to land and to all the other sentient beings that we've been conditioned to view as objects. So I began to understand healing in a much broader context as healing from these systems of colonization, white supremacy, patriarchy, materialism, and I came to see that I had been trained, however unintentionally, not really to liberate people from these systems, but to help them conform. So I had been trained to help people adjust or adapt to a profoundly sick society and to cope with systems of oppression rather than to question them or transform them. And at the core of it all, what sort of connects all of these systems, I began to see that the root trauma of this dominant society was a severance from spirit. And we don't have to understand this in a spiritual framework. We can understand it in a scientific framework. We can look at what quantum physics is telling us, which is that everything is energy and everything is connected. So, individualism, materialism, supremacy, these are all deeply traumatizing falsehoods. And that really altered the course of my life. It changed my work with patients and ultimately led me out of my practice into a different way of working. And once I finally had my ADHD diagnosis, it also led me to a deeper understanding of neurodivergence, not as a
Hmm.
disorder, but as nonconformity. And so I began to do really deep research into this nonconformity as ancestral memory, as a different rhythm and sensory reality that doesn't fit into colonial time. And so now my work is not just about healing individuals, it's about helping us to see life denying systems clearly, to begin to remember, really remember what we've been severed from, to process the rage and grief surrounding those losses, and to reclaim ways of seeing and being that hold us as whole, not broken.
Thank you so much, Christina, for sharing this very profound realization that you're describing. And I'm also glad that you mentioned Canada's long and dark history of cultural genocide and colonial oppression, and the racism and injustice that's continuing to cause trauma even today. If you're disabled and Indigenous, you face a much more heightened risk of abuse or harm. In fact, Indigenous women and girls face the highest rate of victimization and violence here in Canada. The National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls found that Indigenous women are 12 times more likely to be killed or to disappear with little to no action by authorities. I have chills just saying this statistic. 12 times more at risk of violence and death. It's absolutely horrific and completely unacceptable. And I really urge listeners who aren't familiar with the MMIWG inquiry and the calls to action that came out of that to please educate yourself and take action. Kristina, what would you like to share about your own lived experience and professional experience with childhood trauma? And how has that been intertwined with your experience of motherhood and later realizing you are ADHD?
I grew up in a home with pretty severe intergenerational trauma. So my father was a violent alcoholic, and my mother was really disempowered. There was verbal and psychological abuse, and also coercive control. At the same time, we were a white upper middle class family. We took beautiful vacations. And so my father used that privilege to manipulate and gaslight us, insisting that the material comfort was proof that everything was wonderful and we should be grateful. So I learned very early in my life to feel guilty and to suppress the truth. I was also, of course, an undiagnosed neurodivergent child, so extremely sensitive and also wired to attune very deeply to others. And the result was a lot of dissociation, so a really profound split from my own truth, and ending up surviving through vigilance and hyper attunement to others, but no real internalized home or safety. What this meant for me as a professional when I was working with other survivors of childhood trauma was that this experience actually gave me a lived understanding of what they faced. And it allowed us actually to go very deep and really build trust because I was so familiar with the terrain and I knew how to locate them in it. So a lot of my work actually centered around finding and reintegrating parts of the self that were split off by traumatic dissociation, which was really profoundly meaningful work that I now understand in the context of soul retrieval. In terms of mothering, I was really fortunate to be in therapy and training as a therapist when my children were really young. And what this did was give me language for my trauma and a really powerful conviction that I was going to do everything in my power to not pass those patterns on to my sons. However, I was still undiagnosed ADHD. And what that meant was that I was actually misattributing the cause of many of my ongoing symptoms. So, overwhelm, sensory flooding, executive dysfunction, emotional shutdown. I thought all of those things were trauma. And I also repeated some of the relational patterns I had grown up with. I chose narcissistic partners, and I had no real conception of what a boundary was, let alone how to hold one. And before we slide into judgment about that fact, I want to point out that this was not a personality trait, my inability to recognize a boundary. It was the result of a lifetime of normalized and unavoidable override of my boundaries. And that's what happens when you are trying to conform to neurotypical institutions and settings, and also coming out of an abusive home. So, what it meant was that my sense of self was really porous, and I was really oriented to meeting other people's needs. And that meant that, unfortunately, even as a mother and as a therapist, I became a victim again, which initiated me further into much deeper healing work and into deeper understanding of and combating of systemic trauma.
Wow. Yeah. And when you're in survival mode from a very young age, that also overrides any understanding or construction or maintaining of boundaries. Doesn't even exist, right?
Absolutely.
Mhm. Thank you so much for sharing that. So when your sons were born and when they were growing up, you were not yet diagnosed, but you were equipping yourself as a professional with the tools to make sure that you could stop the cycle of harm and generational trauma from continuing. And much later, you found out that you were ADHD, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing this. I appreciate how delicate and painful it can be to dip back into those memories and how daunting it must have been to carry that with you as you were raising a family of your own and doing that with undiagnosed, unsupported autism and ADHD, which is an experience of so many women, including mothers and caretakers. I think this is going to really resonate with listeners, especially our mom listeners. So thank you for being so candid and open about sharing that. It's common for people who have experienced intimate partner violence to experience negative mental health consequences and trauma, especially for teens and young women who experience symptoms that are consistent with PTSD. Other national research has found that 36% of women in Canadian shelters for victims and survivors of abuse noted the adverse impact on their mental health was one of the top challenges they faced after escaping an abusive partner. Then we have to consider the health and mental health impacts that women experience when abusive ex partners stalk, harass, threaten, or cause other havoc in their lives and in their community, especially if they're co parenting. And this includes online and digital monitoring, stalking, threats, and online abuse. Kristina, you've been vocal about your experience as a domestic abuse survivor and your healing journey, and I wanted to thank you for, first of all, helping break the stigma and shame around talking about survivors' experiences and also normalizing talking about it. So, based on your experience as an intimate partner violence survivor, what words of encouragement do you have for other disabled or neurodivergent women to help them recognize warning signs of an abusive partner and the steps that they can carefully take to access support and escape?
I want to name a few specific patterns that women, especially neurodivergent women, should be taught to recognize. And these are things that I wish someone had pointed out for me, in real time. Things like narcissism and fragility. So, where any expression of your perspective or your emotions is met with defensiveness or collapse, and you are made to feel that you're in the wrong. Or Darvo, which is, when you try to address something and you are met with denial, attack, and then the reversal of victim and offender. So you're all of a sudden you're in this argument that they are the victim. Alongside naming these red flags, though, I also want to point out two really crucial truths. I think one of them is that, the general public really does not recognize how widespread the programming is for women to believe that we are the problem, or how they, the public, participate in that programming. And secondly, as a victim, even when you see the situation clearly, it is often neither safe nor possible to leave right away. So I want to really highlight that we live in a culture that blames victims. The number one question people reflexively ask when they hear about domestic violence is always, why didn't she leave? Which is very much like asking what a rape victim was wearing. It's this really malicious sleight of hand that places the blame squarely on her shoulders and completely absolves the man of responsibility for his actions. It's very much like saying that wearing a nice watch means you deserve to be robbed. And so, even post Me Too, we're still working against like literally millennia of patriarchal programming that strategically projects traits like hysteria and instability onto women while pathologizing sensitivity. So, as a victim, even when you start to question what's happening, there's no clear societal mirror for this. And then, even when you know without doubt that there's something terribly wrong, there's very little support and many barriers to navigating what is ultimately a dangerous and extremely challenging situation. Of course, with neurodivergent women, all of this gets magnified because we're already told that we're too much or too sensitive or too emotional. And we are already literally gaslit every day by neurotypical society. So this makes us easier to isolate and less likely to be believed. There's also the economic layer. that many of us don't have the financial freedom to leave, and we may be dependent on our abuser's income or unable to work due to caregiving or disability. And leaving can be extremely expensive, especially when you factor in legal representation. So, if you're someone who can leave or is really close to that threshold, the most important thing I want to say to you is that you are not crazy. For me, the turning point came when I spoke to a lawyer. I was still really downplaying certain things. And she looked me in the eye and she basically said, "This is serious. You need to take this seriously." It was like a slap across the face, in that it actually finally fully pierced the gaslighting. And she told me something really critical, which I already knew in my body but had been pushing away, which is that the most dangerous time in an abusive relationship is when you leave. And she advised me to make a plan, to create a new email address, to rent a house in secret, to move quietly and be strategic. So I reached out to people I trusted, family and friends. I asked for their support in making and executing plans and in dealing with expenses. So if you are preparing to leave, don't do it alone. Find a legal advocate, a women's shelter, a therapist who understands systemic trauma and coercive control. Reach out to people who see you clearly. Make a plan that prioritizes your safety. And above all this, know that it's not your fault. You're not broken. You're not weak. The fact that you've survived this long actually means you are powerful and you deserve to be safe. If you have access to Jess Hill's book, See What You Made Me Do, it is incredibly validating. But you can also watch her speak for free on YouTube. And if you're listening to this right now and you can't leave yet because of finances or fear or disability or kids or just not being ready, I want you to know this: you are not failing. Leaving is not usually immediate. And the first and biggest step doesn't actually happen on the outside, it happens on the inside. It's the step of knowing, even quietly, that you are worthy of safety, you are worthy of respect, period. If you can find even one small way to build on that truth, listening to voices that validate your experience, spending time with people who make you feel sane, creating tiny islands of safety, you are already reclaiming yourself. And that matters. That's the foundation. You don't have to be ready to leave today to begin remembering who you really are.
That's incredible. I'm trying not to cry over here. Yeah, it's so important. I It's not often I'm at a loss for words. I cry.
I'm close to it too. I think that's okay. I think that's
Yeah,
okay.
yeah. I know there are a lot of people listening who will need to hear that. And if I was able to have heard those kinds of words before or even after, I think it would have done something galvanizing to my soul to help get through a time that feels like a complete annihilation of your life and yourself, right?
Yeah, that really is the perfect word for it. It does feel like an annihilation.
Mm. Whew. I gotta collect myself. I remember when it happened to me, people who didn't know the situation said, "That's impossible. You're such a strong feminist. You're such a strong woman. How could you let this happen to yourself?" And the amount of victim blaming, even with the closest people to you. But when you have somebody say, "Well, what do you expect if you saw what he was like, and so you made that choice, and so you're gonna have to deal with your decision. You're gonna have to, you made your bed, now lie in it," type of thing, from people who you would expect sensitivity from. It's amazing how tough other women can be on survivors, and it's because of internalized misogyny. It's because the way that we have been brainwashed and programmed since we were young. But that to me felt like a huge betrayal, that somebody could say, there's no way it could happen to you. You've done all these things. You're so strong. You're a feminist. There's no way it can happen to you. So tell me what really happened.
Yeah, and you really named it. I mean, all of these systems are held in place by deeply unconscious mechanisms that include projection, right? It's true of white supremacy, it's true of patriarchy, and we've all been programmed from every magazine and TV show and movie to really buy this complete inversion of reality, right? And the stereotype is that the abused woman is helpless or unintelligent or uneducated or asking for it or masochistic in some way, and all of that just serves to uphold the system, right, and to
Yeah.
deflect the blame. That's
Hmm.
that sleight of hand I referred to earlier.
Hmm. And like the more that I obviously have done all the work that's needed to be done, and the work is never, never done, but the more I realized about the cycles and the behaviors and the abuses I witnessed from childhood that I experienced as a teenager or even as a young woman. And it almost became an automatic, well, of course, this is just the way it is. This is what women have to deal with, and this is just it. Just get on with it. And you're not a victim. That expression too, don't be a victim. You must have done something to deserve that. That's so damaging. And as you say, it's systemic, it's ingrained. And I'm slowly becoming more vocal about it. The more that I have, the more I realize the vast majority of women I know have these same stories inside them that they are keeping inside for whatever their valid reasons are, or until they feel safe to talk about it. The sheer number of us, and especially neurodivergent women I know, chronically ill women, and otherwise disabled women, and gender diverse people, it it almost seems like it's on the bingo card, the automatic trauma bingo card. It's staggering to me.
Yeah, yeah, the statistics are staggering.
Ooh. It's wild. Sometimes it's easier for me to talk about it as if it happened to someone else,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah,
Because you're like, well, that couldn't happen to me.
yeah.
We are taught that, well, that happens to someone else, because it's this illusion that you're safe. If you do certain things, make certain decisions, it can never happen to you. Of course, it can happen to you. And what I notice is that it happened when I was becoming sick and when my disability was becoming visible. And I didn't know that that also was a red flag for women with disabilities, that somebody will start to be controlling, violent, coercive, while putting on this Oscar winning face of devotion on the outside and absolute horror behind closed doors. Is cognitive dissonance the right word to use? Like, I just remember my brain not being able to compute it. Like, I couldn't compute it.
Yeah, Jess Hill, actually, in her book, which I really highly recommend, she goes into the way that abusers intuitively use a lot of the same tactics that are used in POW camps to actually break down your capacity to trust your own perceptions of reality. Like, it's very, very sophisticated.
And isolating you from others and making you distrust others, or sabotaging relations, even workplace relations. I was like, this can't be my Wednesday afternoon. It cannot be. But it was. Kristina, how did your own experiences with trauma at different stages in your life contribute to the health and well being struggles that you faced as an undiagnosed and unsupported, late realized ADHDer?
For most of my life, I was in a state of constant overwhelm, but I didn't have the words for it. And my symptoms were misread by medical specialists. So, medical specialists ranging from GPs to psychiatrists to neurologists. Sensory overload was mistaken for high anxiety. And autistic traits like feeling different from other people were actually pathologized instead of understood. I experienced what I now recognize as restraint collapse and burnout, but it was diagnosed as depression. And then panic, depersonalization, and cognitive symptoms were seen as dissociative, stemming from trauma, not as results of my neurotype driven past all my limits to conform to neurotypical society.
Hmm.
I masked really heavily. I was high achieving, did a PhD, then switched careers. And in a way that made it easier for people to dismiss or downplay or misperceive my experience. I often looked functional on the outside, but I was falling apart internally, and then did my best to hide the worst of it, which meant that I was really living a double life. I also struggled with a wide range of physical symptoms: chronic migraine, cognitive and vestibular issues, IBS, TMJ, Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, and PTSD. But every time I sought help, the system failed me. My symptoms were dismissed, misdiagnosed, or treated in isolation, and nobody saw the full pattern or asked if I might be neurodivergent.
Hmm.
So all of this really left me feeling broken, like there was something fundamentally wrong. I was afraid I would not live to old age. I often felt like I was actually drowning in plain sight, like I was functioning enough to pass, but I was in some ways completely lost in translation, completely unseen. And there was this really deep and persistent sense of disconnection between my internal reality and the world around me. And the longer that gap went unnamed, the more despair it created. So I've been in therapy really long term. I've trained as a therapist with advanced training. I have a really long term, deep meditation practice. I've tried every form of self improvement available to me, but the symptoms, they remained. And the shame of that was really crippling, especially as a therapist who, I've been sort of trained to believe that I should be able to heal myself in order to heal other people. When it comes to receiving the diagnosis, it is definitely helping me to mitigate and undo the shame. But 50 years of that doesn't just disappear overnight. And I think the most significant thing that diagnosis has given me is access to an accurate understanding of causation. So that really changes everything. Like, I've stopped trying to fix the wrong problem in the wrong way. I've begun to understand my body, to understand overstimulation, to understand what my true limits are, and that these are not actually indications of anything being wrong. It's just a different operating system. Diagnosis has also opened the door to community, to being in relationship with other neurodivergent people who understand this experience from the inside, and so I don't have to translate myself in the way that I've become used to. Um, and from this place, something else really powerful has emerged, like this really deep passion and a mission, really, which is that everything I've lived, everything I've studied, everything I've survived is all coming together now to depathologize neurodivergence, to help other people see what I was never shown, which is that we are not disordered. We are divergent. And we actually carry ways of knowing that this culture has completely forgotten how to honor.
Hmm. And I wonder, obviously, it was lost drip by drip throughout centuries, but do you not also feel like it has really almost been like more of a floodgate instead of a dripping loss in recent years? And I know it's because we're in late stage capitalism right now, and it's a wild ride. But that loss of the knowing, as you say, and the states of being and diverging, and how valuable they were. I mean, anthropologists have talked about how neurodivergent traits were preferred for survival, for community cohesion, for safety, protection, creativity, thriving in lots of ways. And now our society is set up so that each person is a machine, and that machine cannot be quote unquote defective, right? And I love how you said it is not about being disordered, it's about being divergent.
Yeah. Yeah. And I do think we're in a real intensification of all of the pathology, right? All of the pathologies that these systems have reproduced and imposed on us. So
Mhm.
it's definitely a pivotal moment in our history as a species.
At this point in your journey, what lifestyle changes have you been making to find new ways to live more authentically and with more supports built in to be able to better focus on thriving in your own life before doing all the things that you do for others?
One of the most significant changes I've made was leaving my full time career. I realized that my private practice, with its fixed hours and really high demands and masking expectations, was completely unsustainable for my health. So I became an entrepreneur. And that gave me the freedom to create a flexible schedule, one that aligns more with how my brain actually works. So I'm still learning how to follow cycles of energy and rest. I can work when I'm really lit up by passion or novelty, and then I can pull back more when I'm depleted. This is all still evolving. Rest has become much more central. I'm learning to attune better to my body's signals, to notice when I'm heading towards shutdown or meltdown. And I'm really striving to override all the capitalist programming about productivity and value and the expectation that this should be constant and consistent as opposed to moving, in waves and cycles. Receiving coaching from neurodivergent coaches has been really supportive. It's helped me to feel seen and understood and to learn also the importance of things like dopamine regulation and to seek out activities that restore it, like activities that I really love, like drawing or exercise or time outside. Um, I'm learning how to work with my brain instead of against it after 50 years. And that means moving out of a lifetime of forcing and overriding and into honoring more natural rhythms and flow. I'm still very much in the process of unmasking. It's not like this single switch that I can just flip. I'm working against lifelong patterns. And these are really bound up with all sorts of societal conditioning, like not only ableist conditioning, but patriarchal conditioning. Um, I have been conditioned to yield, to make myself smaller, quieter, palatable, pleasant, nice, to center other people's needs and expectations. And even now, that can be incredibly challenging to step out of. I'm also learning to show the parts of me that I was taught to hide. So, especially the incapacity, the exhaustion, the days that I really can't push through. I've carried so much fear and so much shame about being seen as weak or unreliable or too much. So I'm very slowly, very gradually learning how to be seen, in my wholeness, not just my competence. And that it does feel like the beginning of its own kind of liberation. And ironically, this very difficult, sometimes frightening, sometimes painful recalibration is also really landing me in the culmination of my life's work. Everything I've lived through, everything I've studied, from my PhD in English literature and post colonial studies to my clinical experience, as a trauma informed psychotherapist, to my long, deep spiritual practice. It's all coming together now. And it's not in spite of my neurodivergence, but through it. So I'm creating courses that hold this. And the newest course in particular, which is about neurodivergence, is the first time I've built something that doesn't require me to abandon parts of myself to serve others. The academic, the clinician, the survivor, the artist, the mother, the mystic, like all of my gifts, all of my rage, my grief, my faith, they're all present. They're all necessary for what I'm being called into now. And even though I'm still learning how to rest, how to receive, how to be seen, I know that I'm betraying myself less and less in order to belong or be palatable. And that means everything.
Christina, what is a common misconception about disability, and how do you think we can change that narrative?
To me, one of the most damaging misconceptions about disability is the belief that disabled people are somehow weak or broken. And that idea is everywhere. It's sometimes very obvious, sometimes much more covert. And it's rooted, I think, in this really toxic confusion between privilege and merit. So we live in a culture that equates visible material success with worth. It equates ease with strength, and it equates independence with superiority. But in reality, many disabled and neurodivergent people live every day navigating a society that was not built for us, physically, socially, economically, or spiritually. And the truth is, it takes tremendous strength to survive that, to continue to show up, to adapt, to advocate, to live with dignity in a world that often refuses to acknowledge your reality or the obstacles it has created for you. What is even more insidious is that these exact structures that marginalize us then erase their role. So our struggles get framed as personal failures,
Hmm.
and then other people feel entitled to pity us or look down on us as if they've simply, worked harder or made better choices. And to my mind, to shift that narrative, we need to start by unlearning this idea that privilege equals value. Like what what often gets rewarded in our culture isn't actually virtue or strength. It's often comfort and conformity. Because someone has had fewer obstacles does not mean they're stronger. And because
Hmm.
someone has been forced to navigate structural barriers does not mean they're weak. In fact, the opposite is very often true. Many disabled people develop extraordinary resilience, creativity, and insight because we've had to. We've had to develop inner resources that go unseen and unmeasured by conventional standards. And I would go further. I believe that many disabled and neurodivergent people are not only resilient, but we are carriers of profound wisdom. We often have clarity, sensitivity, and insight that comes from being outside the norms of speed, productivity, and surface level communication. We feel the world really intensely. We ask big questions and we see patterns that other people miss. But that wisdom can only emerge when we're not in constant survival mode. So the call isn't just to see disabled people differently, it's to create a world where we can thrive, contribute, and be seen as whole, not despite our differences, but because of them. I think that changing this narrative starts with humility, and I include my own in that because I am always learning from other marginalized and disabled people who can see these systems with much greater clarity because of the way that they land on them. And I think we need to recognize that the people society looks down upon often have way more to teach us than those that it holds up as successful. So that means asking, like, not what's wrong with them, but what have they had to carry and what do they know because of that?
So, as you might know, I have a Finding Avalon playlist, and on it, I feature songs that are chosen by my guests. What is a song or two that speaks to your experience of or your thoughts around disability?
The first one is a song that I have loved for a long time, and it's not only the lyrics. I think there's something about the emotional cadence of the song that has always spoken to me. So this long predates my diagnosis. It's it's sung by Canadian Alessia Cara, and it's called "Scars to Your Beautiful." The lyrics: "There's a hope that's waiting for you in the dark. You should know you're beautiful just the way you are, and you don't have to change a thing. The world could change its heart." And there's something about that line actually that has often brought me to tears. I think because it does shift the lens to the love that should exist for all of us, that we are all entitled to. That's our birthright. One that is much more recent that I actually just discovered is by Reuben and the Bullhorn Singers, and it's called Powerful. So there are many different things that speak to me about it. Part of it is the music itself. It says, if pain is powerful, I'm powerful. It really sort of reframes struggle, I think, in a deep spiritual sense that, pain is not something we're supposed to bypass or somehow magically avoid. It is part of our humanity, it is part of our becoming, it is part of what we move through to become more of who we are. It also contains Indigenous language. And for me, it is always tremendously powerful to listen to Indigenous traditional music in Indigenous languages. I think because they so break the colonial frame and all the ways in which English is such a limited language. There are so many things that are made into objects in the English language. So to hear that music, not only for me is a reflection of the resilience of the Indigenous communities, but it's also, the all that exceeds and breaks through colonial worldviews that cannot be contained. And I find that incredibly, incredibly powerful, incredibly moving.
Thank you so much for these recommendations. I'm going to add them right away to the podcast playlist. And Kristina, finally, in 3 words, whether that's 3 separate words or a 3-word phrase, whatever comes to mind for you, what does disability inclusion mean to you and why?
Nonconformity is sacred. And the reason that really resonates for me is, again, it's shifting away from the pathologizing of the individual to a recognition of these broken systems that are actually oppressing all of us, more visibly and more violently for some than others, but really they're not serving humanity. And so I think recognizing that nonconformity is sacred really invites us to see these broken systems clearly and to strive to dismantle them and to move towards authenticity and liberation.
Before we finish up, is there anything else you'd like to share with us about your upcoming plans and advocacy work? Maybe tell people how they can follow along with you and learn more about what you do?
I am a teacher and a guide and a lifelong student of transformation. So my work has always been about and continues to be about helping people unlearn the shame they've inherited and reconnect to the reality of their original wholeness. I believe that divergence is not a disorder, it's wisdom, and that our suffering very often comes not from who we are, but from a world that has refused to see us clearly. So this June, I will be launching the self-paced online version of my course Transcend, which I taught live online last fall. And this is a course that weaves together neuroscience, psychotherapy, meditation, and spiritual practices as a map to assist you in deep transformation. And then in the fall, I will be offering a live online course on neurodivergence, which I am so
Hmm.
passionate and excited about. So, this is not just for neurodivergent people, it is for clinicians, caregivers, and allies and loved ones. And it's not just teaching us about how neurodivergence looks or functions or feels, it's also a deconstruction of the systems that have misread us, that have pathologized us, and it reclaims neurodivergence as a way of being that is ancestral, somatic, and sacred. If you are interested in following me or my work, you can find me at KristinaKyser.com. I am also on TikTok at Kristina Kyser, and I'm really here to walk beside anyone who's ready to remember and to reclaim the parts of yourselves that you have been conditioned to hide.
Thank you again so much for giving us all of these things to think about and to consider, especially by sharing with such vulnerability and openness. I admire that so much and I appreciate it as another ADHDer. Definitely wishing you all of the good things possible in the chapters to come. And they sound like such exciting chapters. So thank you again.
Thank you, Jen. It has been such a pleasure, and I so deeply appreciate your warmth and authenticity, the ways that you made me feel at home and welcomed me into your space. And I really want to express my gratitude and admiration for the work that you do.
If you're in Canada and you're in an emergency situation, call 911 or your local crisis hotline for support. For emergency accommodation, please reach out to a women's center or a community shelter near you. I'll be linking some more community resources to this post and my blog for this episode. If you're listening and you're in a situation where you are trying to get to safety or you're a survivor, please know that you are not alone. It is not your fault. It may not feel like it right now, but you will get through this. And there are people who care, and there are supports that will help you. You deserve a safe life free of abuse. You matter, and you are not alone. I'm sending you my love. Thanks for being with me and supporting the Finding Avalon podcast. If you can take a minute to help boost my show with a follow, share, and a comment on this episode, you can help me reach more people who could benefit from this timely, authentic, and disabled-led content. Special artist thanks and credit for the unreleased feature song Coal Miner, written by Steve Hoskins, arranged by Naomi Kavka, and performed by Naomi Kavka, Bryn Porter, and Tony Kostelik. See you next time, everybody.